The marble pillars loomed like silent witnesses. Inside the vast chamber, ambition crackled through the air like an electric storm. Senators shuffled papers, whispered rehearsed lines, adjusted their expressions into masks of solemnity. At the center of it all, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. sat quietly at the witness table. No entourage, no lobbyists whispering strategies into his ear. Only the calm, battered dignity of a man walking knowingly into a courtroom that had already decided his fate. He adjusted the microphone once, the faint click echoing into the heavy silence. A defiant act disguised as mere preparation. But inside his heart was a furnace. Not of fear, of clarity. He had spent decades watching institutions he once revered hollow themselves out into tools of profit. Today wasn't about defending himself. It was about pulling the curtain back before they could sew it shut again. The gavel dropped, sharp and hollow. The chairman's opening remarks droned on, words thick with the false gravity of a man paid to pretend concern. Kennedy barely heard them. He watched the room instead, noticed the shifting eyes, the tight grips on pens, the slight quivers of lips rehearsing attacks. They weren't worried about his policies. They were terrified of his refusal to play the game. The first blow came from Senator Margot Rayburn. Mr. Kennedy, how do you justify your reckless endangerment of public health through anti-vaccine conspiracies? The room leaned with her, salivating for blood, but Kennedy didn't blink. I question corruption, Senator. If that's dangerous, then perhaps the danger lies elsewhere. A ripple of unease cracked through the chamber. Not because he had denied the accusation, but because he had shifted the burden back onto them, and they had no defense prepared for that. Across the room, Elizabeth Warren watched with narrowed eyes. She recognized the tactic. Not defense. Offense cloaked in humility. It was more dangerous than any shouting match. It was persuasion, and it was slipping through their fingers. The minutes dragged like slow-moving thunderclouds. Senators launched question after question, each more desperate, more pointed. Kennedy deflected not with anger, but with scalpel precision. Every answer pushed the room closer to a place it feared most: honesty. Then, as if feeling the tide turn, Elizabeth Warren made her move. She leaned forward, voice dipped in honeyed venom. Mr. Kennedy, she began, are you prepared to swear that you will not personally profit from lawsuits targeting pharmaceutical companies during your tenure as secretary? The trap was baited. Frame him as a profiteer. Strip away his credibility before he could wield it. But Kennedy was ready. Senator, I will comply with all ethical guidelines. Warren smiled tightly, pressing. That's not a denial. It's a commitment to serve the public, Kennedy answered. Not corporations, not donors, and certainly not political agendas masquerading as public health. The edges of Warren's smile cracked. For the first time, she felt it. The certainty that she was not interrogating a defendant. She was challenging a force she couldn't control. Behind the polished wood and the carefully cultivated outrage, tremors ran unseen. In a back hallway, a Democratic aide swore under his breath, slamming his tablet shut. He's not losing. He's rewriting the damn rules, another muttered. They had prepared for a conspiracy theorist. Instead, they were facing a statesman. Warren sharpened her voice into a dagger. You could dismantle vaccine programs, undermine decades of progress. Kennedy cut through her words like a wire. Or perhaps, Senator, I could stop billion-dollar corporations from sacrificing children's health for quarterly profits. The words hung like smoke, heavy, unshakable. Panic flashed through Warren's eyes, quickly masked. She wasn't used to opponents who didn't play inside the boundaries she set. You spread lies about autism, about mercury, about vaccine safety, she barked. I share peer-reviewed studies, Kennedy replied, unfazed. Studies the establishment buries because acknowledging them would cost too many people their bonuses. A low murmur rippled across the gallery. No jeering, no applause. Just the raw electricity of a dam breaking. The chairman, sensing loss of control, slammed the gavel again. Order! But order was gone, and in its place grew something far more dangerous: attention. Beyond the polished lenses of the cameras, in the living rooms of ordinary Americans, In the cafes where students huddled over laptops, the words were already spreading. Kennedy wasn't denying mistakes. He was pointing at systemic rot, and people could smell the difference. The chairman called for a recess. Senators practically bolted from their seats. Kennedy remained still, gathering his papers slowly, methodically. Across the chamber, Elizabeth Warren lingered a moment longer. Their eyes locked. No words passed between them. But the message was clear. She had come to bury him. Instead, she was starting to feel the earth shift under her own feet. Outside, the wind tugged at the flags atop the Capitol dome. Inside, a different kind of storm gathered strength. A storm not of noise, but of reckoning. And for the first time in a very long time, the establishment had no idea how to stop it. The recess ended, but the atmosphere never recovered. Senators returned not with the swagger of power, but the rigid stiffness of soldiers forced back onto a battlefield they knew they were losing. The hearing room itself seemed to lean forward, sensing the fracture beneath its marble floors. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. remained in his chair, still and poised, the only man untouched by the rising panic. Inside, he measured every heartbeat. He knew their rhythm now, the manufactured outrage, the forced indignation, the desperate scramble to preserve an illusion that could no longer withstand sunlight. He wasn't just testifying anymore. He was exposing. And exposure was something power never survived. Elizabeth Warren struck first, her voice cutting sharper than before, less polished, more raw. Gone was the lawyerly precision. Now it was survival instinct driving her. "Mr. Kennedy," she snapped, "will you admit here and now that your rhetoric has directly caused vaccine hesitancy, leading to preventable deaths across this nation?" It wasn't a question, it was an execution order. RFK Jr. sat forward, folding his hands, the hint of a smile ghosting across his face, not of amusement, but of grim recognition. "Senator, when institutions sell trust for profit, skepticism is not rebellion. It's the last act of citizenship." The words didn't just answer. They accused. And Warren felt it. Felt the center of gravity slipping, the carefully scripted outrage sagging into something messier, more dangerous. Doubt. Across the room, Democratic aides tightened their grips on tablets and notebooks. The old game, smear, isolate, destroy, was failing. And they didn't have a backup plan. Warren attacked again, faster, almost tripping over her own words. "Do you deny promoting falsehoods about mercury poisoning? About vaccine-related autism? About undermining the safety of life-saving immunizations?" Kennedy's voice lowered, forcing the room to strain closer. "I do not deny uncomfortable truths, Senator. I expose them. If exposure threatens your narrative, perhaps you should question the narrative, not the man revealing it." The strike landed hard, harder than Warren anticipated. A few rows back, a journalist's hand froze halfway across a notebook. Because that wasn't conspiracy. That was courtroom logic. And it was devastating. The chairman tried to intervene, fumbling for control. "Mr. Kennedy, are you suggesting that our entire public health system is compromised?" Kennedy finally turned toward him, gaze steady. "I am suggesting that a system funded by those it regulates cannot claim independence, and a system that punishes questions cannot claim credibility." A tremor rolled through the room. Not noise, energy, the crackling, dangerous kind that precedes a collapse. Warren's knuckles whitened around her notes. She realized then, this wasn't a man she could corner. This was a mirror she couldn't escape. Every attack she launched only reflected back onto her. Every accusation only illuminated her own entanglement. She shifted tactics, desperation seeping into her voice. "Your words embolden extremists. You peddle fear. You endanger children." RFK Jr. tilted his head slightly, the picture of measured patience. "Truth does not create fear, Senator. It reveals it. If your institutions tremble when questioned, perhaps it is not the questions that are dangerous." The spectators inhaled collectively. Someone dropped a pen. Nobody moved to pick it up. At the back of the room, a Democratic strategist cursed under his breath. "She's losing control. He's rewriting the damn hearing live." His colleague didn't answer. She only stared, mouth slightly open. Because it was true. The camera angles, the sound bites, they were all backfiring. Warren wasn't destroying Kennedy. Kennedy was deconstructing the system. Warren regrouped, reaching for a nuclear option. Without widespread vaccination, millions will die. Your reckless crusade against science will cost lives. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. And Kennedy, calm, relentless, leaned forward once more. Senator, lives were already lost. Lost to opioids your regulators approved. Lost to contaminated water your agencies certified safe. Lost to treatments rushed for profit, not proven for safety. His voice sharpened into a scalpel. Your outrage isn't for the lives lost. It's for the monopoly on truth being lost. The room froze again. Only the buzz of fluorescent lights dared fill the silence. Warren's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. She knew she was cornered. Knew the next blow could be fatal. Not to her personally, but to the edifice she spent decades helping build. Still, she swung again. Will you commit, under oath, to never challenge CDC guidelines once appointed? The final trap. Obedience or disqualification. Kennedy smiled, a small, tragic smile, as if pitying the choice she thought she was offering. He rose, not grandly, not theatrically, just stood, and the entire room tilted around him. I will commit to one thing, Senator. The air tightened. I will commit to challenging any institution that demands blind obedience over evidence, any authority that places profit above people, any system that punishes dissent instead of answering it. He paused, letting the words sink deep. If that disqualifies me, then perhaps it is not I who am unfit to serve, but the system itself. The chairman called for another recess, but it didn't matter anymore. The battle had already shifted, not with a viral moment, not with a shout, but with the slow, methodical dismantling of decades of protected narratives. As senators fled the room under the thin pretense of scheduling demands, Warren remained seated for a few heartbeats longer. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers, but she didn't look up. Couldn't, because the cameras were still rolling, and the story was no longer hers to tell. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gathered his documents calmly. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't need to. The establishment had drawn its sword and found itself bleeding from its own wounds. The second recess began in chaos, but it ended in surrender. When the senators filed back into the room, their faces wore the grim determination of cornered men and women trying desperately to salvage dignity from defeat. No more confident posturing, no more eager interruptions. The room had become a tomb, and everyone inside knew it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. sat at the center of it all, still, silent. His expression was unreadable, but inside he felt the shift. They would not recover, not today, not from this. Elizabeth Warren returned to her seat slower than before, her jaw locked so tight it seemed it might shatter under pressure. In her hand, she gripped a fresh batch of notes. Another plan, another last-ditch effort. But deep down, a colder certainty gnawed at her. They weren't fighting Kennedy anymore. They were fighting the collapse of the illusion they had spent decades constructing. The chairman banged the gavel, voice hollow. We will proceed with final questioning, but Kennedy did not wait. He leaned forward, voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. Before the next accusation is launched, I believe the American people deserve some truth. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Senators stiffened. Reporters leaned closer. Warren's lips parted slightly as if to object. But something in Kennedy's tone held her frozen. From a simple folder, Kennedy unfolded a single sheet of paper. Nothing dramatic, nothing grandiose, just numbers. But numbers, he knew, could destroy kingdoms. I submit for the record, he said, voice steady, the financial contributions made by pharmaceutical companies to members of this committee over the past decade. The silence that followed wasn't mere quiet, it was terror, pure and unfiltered. He began to read, one name, one number, then another, and another. The list marched forward like a firing squad. Campaign donations, super PAC injections, research grants. Every dollar was a thread unraveling the myth of impartiality they had clung to. And when he reached Warren's name, he paused, just long enough, just long enough to let the dread settle. Senator Elizabeth Warren, $278,600 received from pharmaceutical and biotech companies between 2014 and 2023. A crack of whispered shock tore through the gallery. Even the stenographers faltered in their typing. Warren lunged for the microphone, voice brittle. "Mr. Kennedy, this is a distraction. This is a conspiracy to undermine public trust in science." Kennedy turned his full gaze onto her, and in that moment, Elizabeth Warren shrank, not physically, but spiritually. "Senator," he said quietly, "trust isn't destroyed by exposure. It's destroyed by betrayal." The blow was surgical, no yelling, no theatrics, only the suffocating weight of a truth too large to spin. The chairman pounded the gavel again, voice trembling. "Mr. Kennedy, this is highly inappropriate," but no one was listening to him anymore. The room had shifted beyond parliamentary control. Warren tried again, reaching deeper into the crumbling arsenal of talking points. "Vaccines save lives. Your dangerous rhetoric is empowering misinformation and harming our citizens." Kennedy's reply was a whisper compared to her shriek, and that made it all the more devastating. When profit dictates science, the danger isn't the questions. The danger is the silence. At the back of the room, two veteran reporters exchanged a look, one of those rare glances that transcended political loyalty. A glance that said, "This isn't just another scandal. This is an unmasking." Warren, feeling the momentum sliding beyond reach, hurled her final charge. "You are not fit to serve the American people. You are a danger to public health." RFK Jr. did not blink. He stood slowly, deliberately, and for a moment, the entire Senate hearing room seemed to tilt toward him, pulled by the gravity of an undeniable shift. "I do not seek to serve corporations," he said. "I seek to serve citizens. If that makes me dangerous, then it says more about this system than it does about me." Somewhere outside the Capitol, as the spring sun dipped lower behind the monuments, news feeds lit up like wildfire. RFK Jr., shocked Senate, Pharma ties exposed, Elizabeth Warren under fire for big pharma contributions. On social media, clips from the hearing exploded across timelines. Americans who had tuned in expecting a demolition watched instead the birth of a new kind of resistance. Inside the hearing room, the senators filed out in silence. No smiles, no handshakes, no victory laps, just the heavy footfalls of an order cracking under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Elizabeth Warren remained seated for a moment longer, staring not at Kennedy, but at the floor, at the reality she could no longer will away, at the truth she could no longer outrun, and for the first time in her long political career, she understood. This wasn't about losing a nomination. It was about losing control. Kennedy packed his papers slowly, methodically. There was no rush. History was already moving in his favor, and for the first time in a long time, truth wasn't trailing behind power. It was leading it. The hearing ended not with applause, not with outrage, but with silence. The kind of silence that speaks of broken illusions and quietly acknowledges a shift too large to reverse. The gavel fell, the senators scattered, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. remained seated unmoving. He could feel it in the marrow of the room. Not victory, something deeper. The collapse of a lie so old it had been mistaken for truth. Elizabeth Warren gathered her papers with trembling fingers. The room blurred around her as she fought to steady her breathing, fought to summon the armor of defiance she had worn for decades. But the cameras captured everything. The tremor in her jaw, the tightness around her eyes, the sudden, irreversible weight of public scrutiny turning inward. She rose stiffly, avoiding Kennedy's gaze, because in that gaze she would find no gloating, only judgment, and that was far more unbearable. Outside, the corridors buzzed like a disturbed hive. Staffers whispered urgently. Reporters barked into phones, scrambling to rewrite leads, sensing the blood in the water and rushing to be the first to name it. Not a partisan fight, not a conspiracy theory, but an exposure of rot, of complicity, of a system that could no longer hide behind polished speeches and polished veneers. Kennedy stepped from the hearing room into the flash of cameras and the avalanche of questions. He did not flinch. He did not smile. He simply walked. Each step was deliberate, each breath a reminder that survival was not the measure of success. Changing the battlefield was. Microphones thrust forward. Questions rained down. Mr. Kennedy, do you believe today's hearing revealed corruption within federal agencies? Will you seek criminal investigations into pharmaceutical lobbying? Do you fear retaliation for your testimony? He paused, turning slightly toward the nearest cluster of journalists. The sun caught his profile, casting long shadows behind him. Truth is not a weapon, he said simply. It's a mirror. If some are wounded by their reflection, that is not my doing. That is theirs. The reporters trained to catch spin heard none. Only clarity. Across the city, cable news scrambled to catch up. Gone were the confident pundits predicting Kennedy's humiliation. In their place came tentative voices, uncertain phrases, a surprisingly poised defense. Serious questions raised about pharmaceutical influence. Public opinion shifting rapidly. The machine was slower than the moment it tried to control, and the American people were faster than both. At small-town diners and union halls, at college campuses and kitchen tables, Americans watched the clips. They saw the calm. They heard the refusal to kneel, and many, for the first time in years, felt something dangerous flicker inside them. Permission, permission to question, permission to refuse, permission to remember that the powerful were supposed to serve, not rule. Inside her office, Elizabeth Warren watched the news feeds populate in real time. Every headline was a nail, every clip a hammer. She gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles blanched. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be the easy kill, a swift political execution to remind America who controlled the boundaries of permissible speech. Instead, she had fed the fire. Warren's advisors circled, offering platitudes and damage control strategies, but she barely heard them. The truth screamed louder. The polls would swing, the donors would grumble, the system would tremble, and she had been the face of its failure. Meanwhile, in a modest hotel room across town, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. removed his tie and sat quietly by the window. The city glittered beyond the glass, unaware that something had shifted forever. He leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pulling at his bones, but a deeper current carrying him forward. Today was not an ending. It was ignition. He had not come to topple a man or a party. He had come to break the spell, and cracks were already spiderwebbing through the edifice. His phone buzzed. Messages flooded in. From old activists long thought defeated. From young organizers just beginning to believe again. From ordinary Americans who simply said, "Thank you. We see you. We're ready." He smiled, small and tired, because he knew the machine would strike back. Harder, dirtier. It always did. But it didn't matter anymore. The veil had been pierced. The emperor had been shown to wear no clothes, and no army of spin doctors could resew the fabric of deception. The next morning, editorial boards scrambled to balance criticism with concession. Senators issued tepid statements condemning misinformation while carefully avoiding mention of their own conflicts. But it was too late. The hearing wasn't a blip. It was a breach, and breaches, once made, only grow. Kennedy stared at the first light creeping across the horizon. He wasn't naive. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. He knew the character assassinations would come, the lawsuits, the threats, the smears. But he also knew something far more important. They were no longer fighting a man. They were fighting an idea. And ideas, once unleashed into the bloodstream of a people hungry for something real, were impossible to kill. Back at the Capitol, Elizabeth Warren stepped onto a private elevator. Alone. No cameras now. No staff. Only the reflection staring back at her in the polished steel doors. For a long moment, she studied herself. And for the first time in her career, she wondered if the enemy she had feared so much wasn't Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It was the truth she had spent so many years learning how to bury. And now it was loose, alive, and very, very angry.